All right.
All right.
We good? Think so?
All right. So today is August 26th, 2022. I am Kevin Yee, the interviewer. Harry Belschner is here as a cameraman, and then we're here with Mr. Michael Hubbard, who is our veteran. So thank you for coming today.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We'll start with where and when you were born.
I was born in Aspen, Colorado in 1984.
Yeah. So what did you do while growing up?
I did as much as possible outside.
Yeah.
We lived in the mountains, so it was great. A lot of outdoor activities. And then when I was in 6th grade, my family moved to Des Moines, Iowa. And so picked up playing hockey and soccer and lived in Iowa through high school and college.
Yeah. So who are your parents and what did they do?
My parents were both teachers. My mom's from Louisiana and my dad was from California, and they met in Colorado and worked at the school as teachers together. So
Yeah. And when you were growing up, did you have any kind of military background in your family or connection to that?
not really. Both my grandpas had served in one in the Army and one in the Air Force during World War II, but one died before I was born and one died when I was pretty young. So
Yeah. So when did you join the military?
I joined when I was 26.
Yeah.
25. So I went to college, graduated college, got a job in the financial world, and then decided to quit my job and join the Marine Corps.
So do you remember what inspired you to join?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the country had been at war for a number of years when I joined, and there's always something that was in the back of my head.
Yeah.
As felt like, as an able-bodied person, that was something that I should do, and part of it was wondering if I was up to it, if I was up to the task of getting through OCS and training and then being in combat and responding in the way that I hoped that I would.
Yeah. So was it kind of like a sense of duty?
It was to some extent, yeah, a sense of duty, and then a sense of, or an effort to overcome my fear. I'd thought about it since I was in high school and didn't have family or friends that were doing that, so it was easy to just take the next path, go to college, get a job, and just kept thinking about it and wondering if I could do it, and so I finally pushed myself to go through with it.
Yeah. So how did your family and friends feel about you joining?
They were very surprised. I didn't tell anybody that I was applying to the Marine Corps. So they were surprised, and my mom was particularly upset. She had some friends. She grew up during Vietnam, and so I had friends that went to Vietnam and didn't come back, so she was very worried. But overall, people were super supportive.
Yeah. So what did you know about the war in Afghanistan at the time?
Just what I saw in the news, not a whole lot of details, and I mean, I didn't watch a whole lot or read a whole lot of news.
Yeah.
So I knew that that's where Osama bin Laden had been, and that's who masterminded 9/11, and that's why we were there. So
Yeah. So when did you go off to training?
like what year?
Yeah.
So I started OCS in the fall of 2013, I'm sorry, I started OCS in the fall of 2009.
Yeah.
So October of 2009.
Yeah. And what was OCS like?
It was a major culture shock. I had no experience with the military. I didn't understand the rank structures. I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. I remember driving into Quantico and thinking to myself, what in God's name had I got myself into? And it was tough. About 50% of my class didn't make it for one reason or another. Either they quit or were forced out or got hurt. But I was lucky. I had a great bunkmate that was a prior enlisted Marine, so he had a lot of experience. He'd been to Iraq,
Yeah.
And he kind of took me under his wing and really helped me out.
Yeah. So, did any of your drill instructors stand out?
Yeah, they all did, in different ways. They were incredibly tough and professional and dedicated. And I would say, when I quit my job to join the Marine Corps, I thought I'd do it for 4 years and get out and
Yeah.
go back to the business world. And going through training at OCS, TBS, and IOC, seeing the professionalism and the competency and the dedication of all my instructors at every stage of the way made me feel like that was something that I could do, that I'd want to do for the rest of my life, is be in the Marine Corps for the rest of my career. So it's a special talent to be able to do what they do. That's for sure.
Yeah. So, while you were in OCS, what was an average day like?
So an average day would be wake up early, everyone would get dressed together, make your bed, hygiene. Then depending on the day, you would march over to breakfast, eat. You had about 2 minutes to eat. So you shoveled as much as you could down, and then you'd come back, march back across the bridge, and then depending on the day, there were physical fitness activities, there were team building challenges, there was field. We'd go out into the field and train, learn tactics, and we also spent a fair amount of time in the classroom learning everything about the Marine Corps, the rank structure, the customs and procedures, and then also learning our TTPs, tactics, techniques and procedures, how to operate, how to be a rifleman. So every day was different. You always had breakfast in the morning and dinner, and then at night, after the lights went out, is when you would clean your uniform and get ready for the next day, study for the exams, prep for everything, do your laundry, prep for everything that you had to do for the next day.
Yeah. So, what do you think was the most challenging part about it?
To some extent, the uncertainty was challenging. The food and sleep was regulated to some extent.
Yeah.
Now you could sleep as much as you wanted, but if you slept 8 hours, you weren't getting everything done that you needed to get done for the next day. So you combined uncertainty with lack of food and lack of sleep, and it's a powerful combination. And it was interesting to see how some people broke down under those circumstances.
Yeah. So, do you have any iconic memories that just represent that time for you?
Yeah, there were some great moments of candidates. Just I mean, we all did. Every single one of us would get so flustered, doing what seemed like should be a simple task, but when you're being yelled at by 4 or 5 different sergeant instructors, it's amazing how difficult a simple task can become, and the sergeant instructors had, in hindsight, some hilarious quips that they hurled at us, insults, I should say, and they didn't seem funny at the time, but now looking back, I mean, it's hilarious, the stuff that came out of their mouths, and some of the dumb stuff that we did, and how we responded to simple situations and tasks. So,
Yeah. Would you say that movies like Jarhead represent that accurately?
I don't think I've seen Jarhead, to be honest with you. Is that the one with Josh Hartnett, or is that a newer one?
That might be a newer one, but
Okay.
do you think these kinds of movies in general are accurate or a little unrealistic?
It's funny. It's a mix of both, and I always find it curious what parts are reasonable and accurate and what parts are embellished.
Yeah.
And clearly it's, the discretion of the director and the producer, but every movie has parts that seem super realistic and accurate, and some that are just completely ridiculous and asinine.
Yeah. So, after OCS ended, where did you go?
So after OCS, I got my commission, and I went to the basic school. So in the Marine Corps, every Marine's a rifleman. So after OCS, every Marine, no matter what you end up being, whether you're an infantry officer or a finance officer, you go through 6 months of TBS. It's called the basic school.
Mm-hmm.
And that's designed to, that basically is where the creed, every man a rifleman comes from in the Marine Corps. So everyone learns the basic skills of being a rifleman, even if you're going to be riding a desk for the rest of your career.
Yeah.
So that was 6 months of training, again, very similar, although now that you were an actual commissioned officer, you had a little more autonomy. The instructors weren't necessarily as aggressive as the sergeant instructors. It was designed more as an education and development school versus a test to see who could make it versus who couldn't, which is really what OCS was about.
Yeah.
So a lot of classroom work, a lot of work out in the field, a lot of physical fitness related activities, and a lot more kind of leadership training. So we would all rotate through different leadership roles that you would have in the infantry and the Marine Corps, and we would have to lead our peers, and which is a great training ground, because when you get to the fleet, you outrank everyone that's in your unit that you're in charge of, and so it's a lot easier to lead people when you're the boss and you can tell them what to do.
Yeah.
When they're your peers, you have to learn how to lead by example, how to convince people that your course of action is the right one, and so it's a great training ground so that you don't come out of TBS and just rely on your rank once you get to the fleet.
Yeah. So, what were your first few days on active duty like?
So after TBS was IOC, which was the infantry officer course, and about halfway through IOC, myself and 3 other lieutenants got pulled aside and told that we were being sent to 1st Battalion 9th Marines in Camp Lejeune, and that when we graduated IOC and when we got there, they would be, I think 3 or 4 months away from deploying to Afghanistan. Maybe it was 6 months at the time. So
yeah.
So it was a quick turn. Graduated IOC in December of 2010. And was in Afghanistan in May of 2011. So first few days in the fleet on active duty were a whirlwind, getting settled into the unit, trying to learn my Marines, my superiors, my peers, and all of them had been working together for months. They all knew each other.
Yeah.
They were pretty deep in their workup, and so it's just getting up to speed and trying to figure everything out on the fly, basically.
Yeah. What surprised you the most about military life?
I would say there were a couple of things. One is, one of the most surprising things is, so through OCS, TBS, IOC, everyone you meet is very similar to you, right? You're all wearing the same uniform. You're all there for a pretty general similar set of reasons. You all generally want the same things, which is to be successful and lead Marines and be a good officer. And so I think what was surprising is how close I would get to people that I was training with and living with. And then when 6 months in, we would go out, if we had a day off, we would go out in town, you'd see them in their civilian clothes, and you'd see what they dress like normally and how they chose to look like when we didn't all have to look the same. And
Yeah.
it was amazing how close I had gotten to people that if I had seen them dressed the way they were, that I probably wouldn't have been friends with, or I wouldn't have thought myself being friends with. So it just was a massive leveling of the playing field, and it stripped everyone of their individuality. And when you do that, it's amazing how similar we all are, and who you end up becoming really close with. And vice, in a normal course of action, you come from different worlds, different backgrounds, you have different likes and hobbies and stuff outside the Marine Corps. And so that was one thing I really didn't expect, was just what that would be like, having all those barriers broken down for you, and just the breadth of people that you get to become really close with.
So the Marines kind of exposed you to like a crossroads of America and just the diversity there.
Yeah, definitely exposed me to a significant amount of diversity on every level. I mean, religion, ethnicity, color, background, socioeconomic status, wholesome families, broken families, high school dropouts, college graduates. I mean, just across the board. It was, and when you're all there for the same purpose, and you're all, again, dressed alike every day and going through the same stuff, it's amazing how all those things that are barriers outside, in normal civilian life to people getting to know each other, just kind of fell away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in the months leading up to your deployment, what was your unit doing, and what were you doing?
So I had the dubious honor of being named the 81's platoon commander as a second lieutenant, as a brand new second lieutenant, which is a billet typically held by first lieutenants who have already done one rotation in an infantry platoon within an infantry battalion. And so I got thrown into that, and normally you would go to a school for, I think, 2 to 3 months to get trained on how to operate the mortar systems, because there's a lot of math involved when you're shooting things directly up and you want them to land in a specific area somewhere out in front of you. And so I didn't have the luxury of going to that school, and all of our exercises and trainings required mortar support and activity. So I had a steep learning curve to get up and to figure out, and so it was nerve-wracking and chaotic, and it was difficult because, again, given that it's normally a more seasoned, experienced lieutenant running that platoon, we were often not with the rest of the battalion during these training exercises. So we would go off and set up wherever the mortars would fire from, and we would be on our own for a significant part of the training exercise, and we have to figure out how to get out there and get back by ourselves, versus most of my, or the other 3 second lieutenants that joined with me, they were all infantry platoon commanders, so they were all with infantry companies that all did everything together. So there were 3 or 4 other second lieutenants that were always, so they had kind of a pack that they could use to help each other out or ask questions or whatever the case may be. And they had kind of transportation logistics figured out for them because it was a bigger unit. And so that was dictated by the company commander and the company XO. So it was a lot to figure out, and I made a lot of mistakes, but did the best I could, and thankfully we made it through and passed all of our field exercises.
Yeah. So when the deployment finally came, how were you transported to Afghanistan?
So we flew on it was probably a 787. It was the whole battalion had a chartered 787. We flew from Camp Lejeune, or North Carolina. We flew to Maine, and then for a quick stop, then we flew to Germany, and then we flew to Kazakhstan, all on the same 787. And then we were in Kazakhstan for a couple of days. And then we flew on, we flew on military airplanes from Kazakhstan into Afghanistan.
Yeah. So what was it like when you first arrived?
It felt like it was chaos. The descent in is pretty aggressive to avoid getting shot down. So it's not a long, gradual approach like you have on a commercial liner. It's a very tight spiral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That puts you down as fast as possible. So it was chaotic. It was also surprising how built up the base was, especially for, well, I shouldn't say, it was especially surprising to me. In hindsight, it shouldn't have been, given how long we'd been operating in the country. We'd been in the country for over a decade at that point. So the infrastructure and the bases were pretty well built up. The runways were paved. I mean, it was it was like a city, essentially. And so get off, unload our gear. That's when we got our bullets and munitions that we were going to have. So that was definitely a sobering moment that, kind of set in that it wasn't a training exercise.
Yeah.
That it was real. And we had about 24 hours before we were going to be flown by helicopter to our patrol bases that each of us was assigned to.
So what about Afghanistan surprised you the most when you first arrived?
I wouldn't say it was necessarily when I first arrived, but once we started going on patrols and once we started interacting with the local population there, again, it was similar to my surprise in the military, joining the military. So leading up, part of our pre-deployment training is a bunch of sensitivity training, essentially, that talks about their culture and their religion and how not to offend them and how you should talk to them and how they're all super religious and how we need to be prepared to interact with the local populace. And after being there for a few months and again meeting lots of the locals and interacting with them, it kind of dawned on me that once again, like, despite all the differences in religion and language and location and education, they're really not different from us, right? Most of them aren't super religious fanatics. They're very much like most Christians here that go to church on Christmas and Easter, right? And in between are trying to do the best they can to feed their family, put a roof over their heads, take care of their kids, raise their crops or sell their wares, whatever it was. And so again, it was eye-opening. Just there's a lot of perceived differences amongst people in the world, and the reality is at a base level we're all pretty similar.
Yeah. So were these interactions with the locals mostly friendly?
Not always. It just depended. There'd be any number of things. Sometimes the locals would come to the base or we'd encounter them and someone either from a different one of our units or a neighboring unit or whatever had done something bad, or there was a firefighter, an IED that damaged their house or their home or their animals in some case, so they understandably wanted help dealing with that or getting that fixed. Most of the time they were super friendly. Some would be very standoffish and scared. That was pretty standard for the Taliban or Al-Qaeda to watch and then see who interacted with U.S. forces and go back and intimidate their family afterwards. So some people were scared, but for the most part I was pretty surprised how receptive people were, and if you worked with them and understood their needs and could help them, I got to be pretty close with a handful local elders and people that we encountered on a pretty regular basis on our patrols.
Yeah. So what was an average patrol like?
Well, it evolved over the course of the 7 months we were there. You know, at first we would just kind of do 3-hour patrols because we had to have patrols outside the wire 24/7, and so
Yeah.
3 hours was a decent rotation based on the number of squads we had, the number of fire teams, and so we would do these 3-hour rotations. And part of our job was to talk to the locals and figure out who lived there and try to get a baseline so we knew when someone new from outside the area was in town or in the area, that was a high probability typically that they were an enemy fighter.
Yeah.
Well, when you're only out for 3 hours, it's really easy to just map a route that takes you 3 hours, and you can walk for 3 hours straight, right? You don't have to stop, so you don't really have to talk to the locals. And so myself and my platoon sergeant couldn't be on every patrol, obviously, because we had Marines outside the wire 24/7.
Yeah.
And so we weren't doing any of the census operations or communicating with the locals that we were supposed to be doing. And so I had the idea to make the patrols, I made the patrols go from 3 hours to 8 to 10 hours. And so what that did is it's very difficult to walk for 10 hours straight.
Yeah.
So inevitably, the patrols would have to stop, and whenever they would stop, people would come up and talk to them, and so it was a forcing mechanism to get to generate interaction between our Marines and the locals.
Yeah. And on these patrols, how much gear did you guys have to carry?
It depended on how long we were going to be out and what the purpose of the mission was. But each Marine would have at least 6 magazines, so 180 rounds. We would wear our flak jackets, which had sappy plates in them, which are about this thick, ceramic plating to stop rounds from an AK-47. Much different than what you see on TV, especially, you know, cop shows. They're wearing kind of thin vests that's apparently stop everything. But if you're going to stop a round out of a rifle, it's a 1/2 to 3/4 inch thick plate. And
Yeah.
the plates, the front and back plate probably weighed 20 pounds total. And then depending on the time, sometimes they would force you to wear, there were plates that would go on the side to protect your sides, which add another, 10, 11 pounds. And then you layer on your water, batteries for the radio. I would carry smoke and flares. I'd carry a grenade or 2 typically. And so I would say if we were just gonna go out for an 8-hour patrol, and then we had some Marines that had 203s or grenade launchers on their M4s, and so that was extra weight on the rifle and extra rounds, which was extra weight. And then we had our saw gunners, and they carried extra rounds. So I would say on our body, if we weren't going to be out, overnight, we carried probably, between 50 and 65 pounds of additional weight. And then if we were going to be out longer, sometimes you'd be at 80, 90, up to maybe 100 pounds, depending on the scenario.
Yeah. So when you were on base, what were your living conditions like?
They were pretty cush, actually.
Yeah.
We had pretty robust tents. Again, it had been there. The patrol bases had been there for so long that they'd been built up. There were generators in place that gave electricity and in some cases air conditioning or heat in the wintertime. And then we had cots that we could sleep on. So It was decent. It was decent. We always, we moved around patrol bases a couple of times each deployment, but mostly you were in the same spot, so you kind of make it your own little home, fully unpack, get comfortable. I mean, it's definitely not, it wasn't anything like, Korea, Vietnam, World War II, that's
Yeah.
for sure.
And what was the food situation like?
It depended if you were a little further out. The patrol bases, it was mostly MREs. Some of the bigger FOBs would have some sort of kitchen, and they would have civilian contractors that would cook maybe lunch and dinner, or cook dinner, and they bring in like lunch meat and stuff like that to make your own sandwiches. So it was like a school cafeteria, maybe a little sparser than that. If you were on a bigger FOB, and if you were further out, it was MREs.
Yeah. And would you say there was like a strong sense of community in your unit?
There wasn't at first. So the night we got to Afghanistan, they decided that they were going to reorganize our unit. So they split up the mortar platoon because they wanted to put Marines that knew how to fire the mortars at each one of our patrol bases.
Mm-hmm.
And so they took half of my platoon and the mortars and integrated them with the other platoons in our company. And then they took Marines from those platoons and added them to my platoon and gave me a new platoon sergeant. So 12 hours before we flew to our patrol base, half of my unit was new, and the number 2 guy, in the platoon who had the most experience was new as well. So we had a lot of work to do building that cohesion within the unit. And then the other thing that was kind of interesting is because what we saw as the months went on is each squad developed really strong cohesion because that's who they patrolled with. But we never did anything as a full platoon.
Yeah.
Maybe it would be a squad and a half or 2 squads that would go out, if it was a longer operation, but there was always Marines that had to stay back at the FOB or patrol base to protect it, obviously. So we never did any operations or activities as a full platoon, and so the squads became really, really tight. And later in the deployment, there started to be some rivalry between some of the squads because they had gotten so close as within each squad, but the squads hadn't gotten close as a platoon. So that was an interesting dynamic that we had to figure out how to solve, because again, we couldn't take the whole platoon outside of the wire and do what you would normally do to help build that cohesion.
Yeah. So did you stay at the same base for all 7 months?
No, our first FOB was in the northern part of Treknawa, which is, if I remember right, just southeast of Marja. And so Marja was a really big city that had, there was a large battle in 2009, I want to say, 2009, 2010 to retake the city.
Yeah.
And so another battalion was stationed there, and first Battalion 9th Marines was in Treknawa, and then there was a kind of a desert in between. And so about halfway into the deployment, what both battalion commanders realized is that the enemy would come into either city, lay an IED, or create small arms fire, create disturbances, intimidate the government officials or the local elders or the population, and then they would disappear back into the desert. So they sent my platoon out into the desert they sent our entire company, but they sent our company out into the desert basically so that there wasn't a safe zone that the enemy could retreat to. And so our job was basically to keep the enemy out there occupied so that the Marines in Marja and Nawa and Treknawa could all conduct their work with the civilian leaders, the government officials, and the locals with less interference from the enemy.
Yeah. And at the time, was the enemy the Taliban?
You never really knew, but yes, it was some version of the Taliban or Al Qaeda, essentially. So you never, and they were kind of allied against U.S. and NATO forces, even though they had different aims. But the Taliban had been the government of Afghanistan, and we were fighting them because they had knowingly allowed Osama bin Laden to build Al Qaeda and train for the terrorist attacks on September for 9/11, right? So it wasn't like they wore uniforms or anything, and a lot of people kind of confuse the Taliban and Al Qaeda. What's funny is in the late 90s, the U.S., the leaders of the Taliban actually came to the United States and met with a number of congressional leaders because they wanted to be recognized as the official government of Afghanistan, and that was almost granted at the time, and it wasn't for a number of reasons, but it's kind of fascinating. And there's still a lot of confusion about the difference between the two.
Yeah. And did you ever have any encounters with the Taliban or other enemy groups?
Yeah, we did. We had our first patrol out. We had a number of encounters with them. There was basically a road that came through our area of operations, and the unit we relieved basically said, anytime you go, a kilometer north of that road, you're going to encounter enemy contact. So we patrolled for a number of weeks. We would always take contact up there, and so over time we kind of were able to figure out how they were attacking us, and so we started to change our patrol routes and change our strategy a little bit, and we were able to bait them into a few engagements, and in those engagements we were able to capture or kill a significant majority of them. So they had estimated there were probably about 20 to 30 enemy fighters in that area. And over the course of a couple engagements with them, we took out between 7 and 10 of those enemy fighters. And after that, there